welcome. We're very happy to have you. And we thank our wonderful caterers for the really nice meal that they provided for us this evening. That was really good. So anyway, as most of you know, we've been doing In Good Faith for quite a while. We in the Bernardin Center, along with the committee members of this initiative, really believe that this is critically important for us to build relationships with people who are of a different faith than ourselves. And these relationships are continually fostered and strengthened in our dialogue here in Good Faith. So the In Good Faith program has really become a mainstay of the Bernardin Center. And through all the efforts of us as well as others who have participated over the years, we've learned so much from one another. And I think we understand each other better and care for each other at a much deeper level. So it's wonderful to have all of you here this evening. Our theme or our topic for tonight is called Setting the Captives Free, Incarceration and Liberty in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We have, with each panelist, once we get started, we'll have 15 minutes to present his point of view. We have no hers tonight, we have only his's, presenting their perspective. And I realize when I say 15 minutes that that's barely time to even give a minimal sketch of what this is all about. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have. And we have the opportunity to dialogue at our tables as we move through the evening. So hopefully we can be enriched again and again with the speakers through the course of the evening. So we have 3 outstanding speakers for this evening, and I'm very pleased to introduce them to you. I'll introduce them all, and then when I'm finished with the 3 introductions, you can come up and sit down here. So the first is Frederick Thaufeer, al-Deen. Frederick has a graduate degree in political science and public administration. He has served in the military police corps, in the United States Army. He was an operations officer for the military district of Washington, D.C., and served tours of duty in Vietnam and Ethiopia. He administered civil affairs programs, served as a provost marshal in Ethiopia, and managed military penal facilities. He also has served as a correctional planner with the Oklahoma Crime Commission in the areas of juvenile justice and adult corrections. Programs and services, he was a programs and services director of the Oklahoma Department of Corrections and assistant superintendent of the Oklahoma City Halfway House. He co-authored Questions of Faith for Muslim Inmates and authored How to Raise Black Boys That Live. Recently, he completed Suspect Shepherds, Despised Flock, a chapter in the Handbook of African American Islam, published by Oxford University Press. And this is a publication that's pending. And he also was featured in the PBS Homegrown show. And he's contributed to numerous books and authored numerous articles. Our second speaker is Father Dave Kelly, who's a member of the Precious Blood community. He's a Catholic priest, and he has worked for Colby House at Assumption, a parish-based jail ministry of the Archdiocese of Chicago, since 1985. For more than 30 years, he has worked as a chaplain in Cook County Jail and Cook County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center. And he's had experience working in jails and prisons in Ohio and Florida. In 2002, Dave, along with other members of his religious congregation, began the Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation to create a place and effort for those who have been impacted by violence and conflict. The Precious Blood Center of Reconciliation reaches out to one who has been harmed, the one who has done the harm, and the community. And the ministry also strives to be a resource to other groups and communities who seek reconciliation. Dave is also active in peacemaking circle training, which he's done many times here at CTU for our peace builders. Dave received his Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry from St. Joseph's College, a Master's of Divinity and Master's of Arts in Cross-Cultural Studies, and a Doctorate of Ministry from the Catholic Theological Union. Where else? His doctoral thesis is entitled Responding to Violence Among Urban Youth, a Restorative Approach. He has been trained and certified as a mediator from DePaul University and has received training in the restorative practice of peacemaking circles. And he's published articles and spoken on reconciliation, restorative justice, and jail detention ministry. Dr. Victor Mirelman, Rabbi Emeritus Victor Mirelman, has been a rabbi of West Suburban Temple Har Zion since 1990. From 1975 to 1989, he was the spiritual leader of Congregation B'nai Israel in Millburn, New Jersey, at which time he was also visiting professor of history at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. During 1970 to 74, he lectured at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, concentrating his courses in the modern and contemporary history of the Jewish people. A native of Argentina, Dr. Mirelman received an MS in mathematics from the University of Buenos Aires. He was ordained as rabbi at the Jewish Theological Seminary and received his doctorate from Columbia University. He is an authority on Latin American Jewry, an area to which he devoted his doctoral dissertation and numerous articles in scholarly publications. Rabbi Mirelman also has a special interest, both personal and academic, in Sephardic Jewry. His most recent book, Jewish Buenos Aires, 1890 to 1930, was published by Wayne State University Press. In 1991, he was appointed professor of Jewish history at Spertus College in Chicago. And in 2005, he was elected president of the Chicago Board of Rabbis. And Rabbi Mirelman has also been part of the In Good Faith endeavor since the very beginning. He was a member of the first steering committee and continues to serve on the committee. So welcome, gentlemen. Please come forward.
Good evening to everybody and welcome. And I want to thank the whole committee for asking me to present tonight. Since we don't have too much time, I'll go right into the presentation. A colleague of mine telling a group of friends about his experience as a chaplain in one of the New York prisons said that the reaction of the people was very interesting. They all loved his stories, biblical stories and customs and so on of the Jewish faith, but they all agreed that they liked the stories of the Exodus from Egypt the best. And then he said as an afterthought, but they all wanted me to repeat an incident that occurs at the Seder. The Seder is the festive meal that Jews observe at the beginning of the Passover, when they open the door wide open for Elijah to come in. We love it when the door is wide open. Jails in antiquity and up to the end of the Middle Ages almost were not used for punitive reasons. Rather, they were used for the culprits to wait for a trial, or the accused, or to wait for a sentence, or sometimes to wait for the execution of the death sentence. Only in the 14th century we see the building of penitentiaries for punitive reasons. There's one story in Genesis that touches upon this, and that's the story of Joseph. Joseph is sent to Beit Asoar, a type of imprisonment, but not punitive. It was mainly for political reasons, or, palace politics, as the story tells us. He was probably awaiting a trial, but it never came, the trial never took place. According to some commentaries, this is a type of midrash, commentaries on the biblical stories, say that he was probably never brought to trial because Mrs. Potiphar, the woman who tried to seduce him originally, was still trying to see if she could get somewhere with him while he was in the prison. So the text reflects on the loneliness of Joseph. He only trusts in God. The butler, who comes to him for the interpretation of his own dreams, eventually is freed. And Moses tells the butler, when you go out, remember me. But the butler forgot about Joseph. This is indicative of the plight of the person in prison. The worst nightmare of a prisoner is the thought of being forgotten. There are different types of jails. There are those usually reserved for the former governors of the state of Illinois. They are prisons with minimum security. The prisoners are physically protected. And then on the other extreme, there is the Guantanamo Bay and all types of shades in between. Individuals are made captives or imprisoned for very different reasons. There are the prisoners of conscience. They're jailed because of their political, religious, or other conscientiously held beliefs, or ethnic origins, or their sex, or color, national or social origins, economic status, sexual orientation, and so on, provided they have neither used nor advocated violence. There are different Jewish views, and the mainstream views of Jews is very clear. Let my people go. The story of the Exodus from Egypt. A people in captivity is eventually shown the way to freedom. And that is the leitmotif in a lot of aspects of Jewish life. It's not a definite posture of Judaism, but as we discussed in our table, is a view held by a lot of Jews. Later at Sinai, as the story goes on, 7 weeks after the Exodus, they arrived at Sinai. And the 10 Commandments were given there, or the whole Torah, if you will. But what does the first commandment say? It's God's presentation. I am the Lord who brought you, the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, from the land of slavery, from the house of slavery. So the presentation of God, the presentation card is, I am the person who frees the slaves or the captives. So that is, again, a very powerful impression made on the Jewish people. God's self-definition is the entity that brought the people out of Egypt. And there is the Jewish proclivity to the liberation of the captives in general. Let my people go. Specifically, in modern times, the fight for Soviet Jewry, which was made a top item in the agenda of Jews in America and in Israel in some respects and throughout the world. For decades, from the mid-60s to 1991, in which the Soviet Union fell, there was a clamor in American Jewry, and I remember, and I'm sure others here were present in the March on Washington in the late 80s when Gorbachev came, and this huge manifestation of Jews and non-Jews on behalf of Soviet Jewry, among many others. There was also the eventual redemption of Ethiopian Jewry in the 1980s and following years. The resettlement of 750,000 Jews from some of the Arab countries as an aftermath of World War II and that time in which the State of Israel came into being, when their plight and their status deteriorated in most of these countries. So this sentiment led to the creation of organizations to help resettlement of Jews who were once captive in other areas, to retrain them, to teach them new languages and skills, and providing shelter and subsistence, like Hayas, like JDC, the federations systems in this country and throughout the world, and many others. There's also the proclivity of Jews to fight for the freedom of all captives, of all people, not only those who are enslaved in prisons, but enslaved to ignorance and to poverty. And one great example is the American Jewish World Service that's been active in this country and benefits people of all faiths, but through a Jewish initiative throughout the world. I myself studied and actually published a monograph on the Jewish involvement in the plight of captives in Argentina, my place of origin, my country of origin, during the last junta in the late 70s and early 80s, when we now know, or we knew towards the end of that period, that there were Nazi-like detention camps, torture camps, and extermination camps, not only against Jews, but mainly against leftists in those days. But the Jewish plight, even the pressure coming from abroad, was very, very deeply felt in those days. And organizations such as the Anti-Defamation League, and to some extent the American Jewish Committee, had a role in putting that pressure. And in the liberation of captives by the military of all faiths, of all ways of life, not only Jews. In many of these examples, especially regarding Soviet Jewry, there was an element of ransom as well. Pay money to liberate individuals. And there's a classic attitude towards ransom. And I'm going a little fast, but Maimonides, for example, praises ransoming of captives, saying that one fulfills up to 7 commandments just by doing so. Another medieval authority, rabbinic authority, Rabbi Joseph Colon, compares the delay in freeing a captive to murder. In most Jewish communities throughout history, there was always a committee for the redemption of captives. It's Chevrat Pidyon Shvuim. In going through the first community in the Western world, the first Jewish community that was started in Recife in Brazil, northeastern Brazil, in the 1630s, there was a Chevrat Pidyon Shvuim, a committee for the ransoming of captives. The reasons might vary, but the institution, the permanent institution throughout the Jewish world is very interesting. In the United States, the decade before September 11, 2001, the FBI brought most American hostages back home safely by engaging directly with kidnappers. That changed drastically after September 11. As we know from the news over the past years or past few months, the approach is different. There is an ongoing controversy regarding this in the general community as well as in the Jewish community. Is ransoming effective, or is it to be shunned up, like at this point is the policy of our government? There were some Jews, even in a famous case in medieval times of a rabbi who was kidnapped, who said, do not pay the ransom, because the only consequence of paying a ransom is that they'll do it again with others, and then we'll have to pay all the time. I have a little quote from Ecclesiastes Rabbah in your little booklets there, and it compares, this is a rabbinic text, it compares a situation of an individual or individuals with a group of robbers. If you look in the middle of the quote, a robber band bound in a prison, one dug a hole and all escaped but one. When the jailer came, he began to beat him and he said, miserable wretch, hapless fellow, the whole lay before you and you did not run away. This was with respect to repentance, basically. A person who has sinned, there is a hole and escaped from the sin through repentance, and one person did not take it. But it's compared to a jail. So I took this because it sort of sheds some light on the issue of being in jail and the plight of the person in jail. So God in the time to come will say to the wicked, continues the passage, repentance was before you and you did not repent. Rabbi Josiah said, for 3 reasons God is long-suffering to the wicked. Perhaps they will repent, or perhaps they will fulfill some commandments, and the reward of which he may pay to them in this world, and perhaps some righteous sons may issue from them, as Josiah of Ammon, Hezekiah of Ahaz, and Mordechai of Shimi. Now, there are many types of jails, as I mentioned earlier. Prisoners of conscience is only one thing. There is the common sinner, the common culprit, the person who has stolen things or who has committed petty crimes, and other types. The main purpose and the role of, say, a chaplain or a Jewish chaplain specifically is to look for the rehabilitation of the captive, of the person imprisoned, to prevent recidivism. We know that 2/3 of the people who come out of jail relapse within 3 to 5 years. And over 56% even before 3 years. So this is a terrible problem. So the main purpose is to strengthen the person in jail so he or she will not commit a relapse. The Jewish ministry in the jails is slightly different from other religions. Perhaps it may be compared to the situation of a Muslim, but we'll hear from that in a few more minutes. Company is important. Care for the prisoner is important. It is an antidote to loneliness and despair. But there are conversionary attempts in the jails. There is also the additional fear of anti-Semitism by the guards and other inmates. And complaining at times is not good because it might create even more animosity towards the complainer. So part of the role of the ministry in the jails is to educate the prison authorities as to the Jewish customs and observances, to encourage observances, to create a better spiritual attitude among the inmates, and education is at the top of the list in order to teach them skills that will help them once outside the jail. I had 2 students at Spertus downtown who were in jail. One was in Michigan, and I remember sending papers back and forth to the prison and receiving them back. And then, the other one, I don't know where it was, but it was an interesting experience for me to be in touch, and I think it was helpful. I hope it was helpful. I did not keep in touch. This took place between 18 and 20 years ago. The main aim, therefore, is the eradication of crime and the rehabilitation of the criminal. This involves much more than the acknowledgement of wrongdoing and punishment. Former criminals must be taught what is right and how to do it and why. Lectures, courses, talks, one-on-one. But who has the budget for all this? Individual rabbis have a long list of other things to do in their day. Especially designated chaplains exist, but not enough. A mentor of mine regarding the visitations to jail was Rabbi Philip Olstad. When I was a student at the seminary in New York in the late 60s, he lived at the seminary. He was a bachelor. He was an older man, but he visited the penitentiaries in New York for over 30 years. And I went with him. And it was a magnificent eye-opener to me. My goals, he said, are the same as those of prison authorities, to make better human beings. The only difference is that their means are descriptive, are discipline, security, and iron bars. Mine are the spiritual ministrations that operate with the mind and the heart. I'm going to skip because I'm being told I have just a little bit, but there is another aspect of the involvement in Judaism. Judaism is very respectful of law as well. So on the one hand, there is compassion for the prisoner, but also there is a strong sense of justice in Judaism. And we have notorious incidents. I'd like just to give you a few examples. We have Jews who have been spies, notorious spies, like Ethel and Julius Rosenberg in the late 40s and early 50s during the beginning of the Cold War. They were tried and sentenced to death. It was a very deeply felt in the Jewish community because of the repercussions. These were Jews, of course they were communists, but affiliated with the party. But they spied and gave the Russians information, vital information. But Jews, and basically a basic attitude of Jews is against the death penalty. And it was proven, I think, at least in my eyes, correct because Ethel Rosenberg was actually framed by her own brother. And this we learned many years later. But by the time we learned that, she was gone. Jonathan Pollard is another spy, a notorious spy in the Jewish faith. But he gave information to an ally nation, Israel. But he's still in jail 30 years later. This created a different response in the Jewish community. While the Rosenberg case did not create a negative response among Jews, the Pollard case did. There are a few who said he should remain in prison. Others, and I would say the vast majority of the Jews, say it's enough already. He's been there a long time. It's very different when you give some information to an ally than giving it to an enemy, like the Soviet Union in those days. Then there is, and this I will finish, the attitude which, based on one verse in Deuteronomy that says, V'asita ayashar v'atov be'enei Hashem, and you shall do the right thing and the good thing in the sight of God, or in the eyes of God. And from this, they remember, the commentaries say, and Maimonides actually highlights this is a warning, because some people can be scoundrels within the limits of the law. So you shall be aware to do the right thing in the eyes of God, not in your own eyes. In your own eyes, it's like in the time of the judges. Everybody did what was right in his own eyes. Everybody's righteous in his own eyes, you know. But in the eyes of God, it's different. So there are people, as Oliver mentioned on a telephone conversation, he knows a few people in his line of business, you know, like the Ivan Boskis and Michael Milken, and not to mention Bernie Madoff, but each one was different. But from the Jewish perspective, Ivan Boesky, you know, and I know this because in the late 80s I was in the East, and I taught at the seminary, as Sheila mentioned. While Ivan Boesky was at the top of his money making, and he was making a lot of money, he was a philanthropist. And he gave the Jewish Theological Seminary a very, very big amount of money to name the library after him and his wife. And I was teaching, one day I saw the library named after him, and then the scandal broke up. You know, the front pages of the New York Post had the picture of Ivan Boesky being adulated by the Jews because of his donation, you know, pure anti-Semitism. And the next week, the name of the library changed. I mean, it was empty, and a few months later, it was named after a Chicago philanthropist, Chicago connection. And they said that Ivan Boesky asked for that. He went to jail. He could never deal in Wall Street anymore. But he repented. And he eventually took courses at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And I could see him. He never took my courses, but he was there quiet, like, you know, very remorseful. Eventually went down to Florida. Michael Milliken also spent time in jail. He could not practice anymore, but he became a wonderful philanthropist, especially in medical research. And he is very much recognized for that. I don't know what will happen with Madoff. It's too close to tell. The final aspect of my presentation is that there are Jews in the mob scene too. There were. The Meyer Lansky is one of the great examples. He was in the New York central figure, in Vegas, in Havana before the Castro Revolution. He did everything. And one day in 1970, to escape the accusations of tax evasion, he went to Israel. And he lived in Herzliya Pituach, a very nice place just north of Tel Aviv. And the Israeli authorities deported him back to the United States, in spite of the fact that there is the law of return, that any Jew in the world can find a place in Israel. He was deported. It's not for criminals. So this is part and parcel of the attitude that many Jews have towards crime. Justice is important. And you cannot abet a criminal for the sake of being compassionate to another individual. So I have a few more examples, but I think I'll shut. He tells me not to shut up already. Thank you very much. Thank you.
My appreciation to Director Sheila McLaughlin and to Dr. Scott Alexander and to the Bernardin Center for Theology and Ministry for the invitation to address our subject tonight. And I greet my co-speakers, Rabbi Mirelman and Reverend Kelly, submitting to God. Shalom and peace be with you. My comments come from years of involvement in corrections as a program planner in the Johnson era Omnibus Crime and Safe Streets Act, and as an armed law enforcement official, as a hands-on prison deputy administrator, and as a prison chaplain, working at the state and federal levels of government in the theater of war and domestically. I want to open a window for you into a career of several decades in this service area to give you an idea of the modern face of imprisonment, captivity, and liberation today. And to that end, I will share 4 anecdotes from my service in the House of Corrections. And then, because what Islam is remains a clouded, complex mystery cloaked in controversy and still unknown for many people, I want to offer a template to explain the Islamic ideal. And following that explanation, I want to describe how imprisonment and captivity can arise in an idyllic Islamic world. And if I don't get into it later, I'm going to be discussing the concepts of education, the development of the orphan, the emergence of free agents in society, which is the goal of the Islamic community, the concept of prisoner, i.e. the person who winds up being incarcerated or detained because of the operation of a fact-based, rational approach for arriving at justice. We'll talk about the emergence or the appearance of prisoners of war in this idyllic Islamic state. And lastly, the appearance of people who are captives. Captives being defined as persons who are victimized by ignorance, injustice, addictions, and so are imprisoned wrongfully. And finally, we want to mention the concept of freeing. In Islam, those who commit hudud, that is, those crimes for which punishments are prescribed in the Quran, are punished according to those laws, that guidance. For those who commit lesser crimes, the goal is to get them out of detention or prison as soon as possible so that they can go back to living their lives and taking care of their families and not become a burden on the state. The 4 anecdotes are taken from my years of service, as I said, in the House of Corrections, and from the perspective as supervisory chaplain at 2 of the country's maximum security penitentiaries, Leavenworth, Kansas, and Marion, Illinois. I have entitled these anecdotes Bust, Bacon, Bobby, and Oops. Bust. Prisons at the state and federal levels have always had insufficient people to serve as imams for the Muslim prisoner population. while I was employed with the state of Oklahoma as a director of what became the Department of Programs and Services, I undertook the additional task of trying to serve the needs of Muslim inmates who were in some of our more isolated institutions. So several times a month I had invested gas and food money to identify where they were and what their needs were, spiritual needs and educational needs. And I went out there on my own time and dime. And after several months in this effort, I began to notice that there was no progress. Muslim numbers were unstable, and the members of the prisoner communities typically remained untrusting and aloof from me and from one another. Communities never formed. I had the occasion on one visit to ask a couple of inmates I trusted, what's going on? Why are we not getting along? What is the reason for this angst and this upset, suspicion? They exhaled and said, well, the problem is we have an informant in our midst. It seems that in a couple of prisons in this system, the wardens, wanting to make sure that they had good intelligence on certain inmate groups, assigned leaders to the groups to be their imam or ministers. And as a result, every time the group was making spiritual or educational progress, something would happen and people would be taken away and the program would be a bust. Bacon. After I graduated from the Glencoe training facility that all Bureau of Prisons officials attend, where we took courses like martial arts and marksmanship and counseling, pastoral care, role playing, and things of that nature, I went to my first assigned duty station, USP Leavenworth, United States Penitentiary, Leavenworth, Kansas. And after I arrived in town, I received a telephone call from the man who would be my boss, the chief chaplain at the Leavenworth facility. And he invited me over the coming weekend to have dinner with himself and a couple of volunteers from Volunteers in Corrections. So the evening of the dinner, I showed up at his house. I was introduced and we all sat around the table and did some pre-dinner chit-chat, and then the food was served. I looked at the table. I looked at the platter of food, I looked at the pots. There was green beans with bacon, sirloin steaks wrapped in bacon, and the most beautiful macaroni and cheese you could see, sprinkled with bacon. So I'm sitting there saying, this is my first duty station, this is my boss, and the volunteers were going to be my assignment in addition to being the Muslim chaplain and chaplains to the rest of the inmates there. So what was I supposed to do? This is my boss. This is my first job in a long time. Do I say, excuse me, how can you be ministering to other inmates of other faiths if this is how you treat the chaplain who's going to be in charge of the Muslims? Did you miss the diversity training? I mean, talk to me. What do you do? Do you leave? Bobby. Now this story takes place at the same penitentiary a couple of months later. I am now my own boss. I am the chief chaplain now. So I'm sitting in my office in the lobby, door open because it's open time, and inmates can come and go and talk in private or in general. And in walks this Caucasian inmate, long blonde hair, prison khakis, handsome young man, blue eyes, and on his neck were the thunderbolt tattoos of the Aryan nation. His shirt was open and he had prisoners lift weights in there, massive and huge. And across his chest were the words, white power. So he's standing just inside the doorway. And his sleeves are rolled up and I see on his arms swastikas. So I'm saying, this is the early time of my tenure here, young man. What's going to go on? So he walks in, very somber looking, And he approaches me, and I'm sitting down. And because the Aryan Brotherhood is a violent group, I default in my mind and my body to my martial arts training. So I stand up to get ready for I didn't know what. He was about 4 paces away from me. And then, looking at me still with this serious, strange look on his face, he took 2 more steps toward me, and I prepared for what was going to happen next. I said, "How can I help you, young man?" He says, "Chaplain?" I said, "Yes." "My name is Bobby." He said, "Hi, Bobby. I'm Chaplain al-Deen. How can I help you?" He says, "I want to become a Muslim." Just as he said that, I noticed in the doorway were 3 African-American Muslims. All of the Muslims in Leavenworth prisons are African-Americans. And here's Bobby standing there saying he wants to be a Muslim. So I see this as a teachable moment. I said, "But you guys, excuse me, Bobby, come with me." And we went into my office. I closed the door. And we had a discussion. "Bobby, I hear what you're saying, but you have to understand the confusion on my part. Thunderbolts, white power, swastikas. What's up?" He says, "Chaplain, I want to become a Muslim. I'm sincere." He was crying. I said, "I understand that, but you're part of a gang, and it's going to be problematic if you are with African-American Muslims making prayer. I don't want a group of guys breaking in on Friday prayer and starting a riot." He said to me, "Chaplain, my brothers," meaning the other people in the Aryan Brotherhood, "accept my conversion and they support me." Well, I was stupefied. We talked a little bit more. I got to know him a little bit better. And then our session ended and he left. As soon as I walked to the door to let Bobby out, the 3 African-American Muslim inmates come in, and these are big strapping guys. And I knew the question that was on their lips. "Chaplain," I said, "Yes. What are we going to do about Bobby?" The next day, the word had gotten around the prison. The captain of security came and talked to me and said, "Chaplain, what the hell is going on? Is this sincere? Is this legit?" I said, "As far as I can tell, it is. And I've observed him, and we had an early afternoon prayer with him, and everything seemed to go well." He said, "Are we going to have problems on our hand?" I said, "No, from what I can see, nothing's going to happen." Then, after the captain of security left, here comes the warden. "Chaplain." "Yes, sir." You better have some words to say to me now to explain what's going on." And I told him what was going on. And after I explained to the warden, "No problem." And I told him, "Here's the strategy we're going to employ." He agreed, and we went about the business of doing that. I'll get to the 4th anecdote in just a minute, but I want to get back to the importance of understanding Islam, and I want to use the concept of a template to tell you ideally how Islam is supposed to work, how the Islamic society should be structured. I gave a handout. I don't know if we have it out yet. This is based on that translation of Suratul Balad that I provided. I'm not going to go over it. You can read it, and it sort of structures what I'm going to say here. So how does Islam approach the subject of freeing the captive and liberation, incarceration? Ideally, everybody believes in God. Doesn't have to be Allah, but they have to have a concept of God, preferably that comes from the previous scriptures that came to Musa alayhi salam and the son of Mary. God's peace and blessings be upon them both. The society understands that these prophets are exemplars. They're the way people who are Jewish or Christian are supposed to be, or Native Americans, and the prophets of their group are supposed to be. They understand that the Quran is a desideratum of God. That is how God would have people understand revelation. In this idealized Islamic state, there's a high value placed on lifelong learning, critical thinking, being resourceful and of use to the larger society. And the goal of life in this idealized Islam is the favor of God. Ni'matullah. What is that? The favor of God is that state of existence wherein the person is typically each member of society is educated, mentored, and develops into a respected, socially oriented resource person, and wherein the typical outcome of what he or she intends for good is achieved more often than not. These resourceful persons try to carry out the mundane acts of living with excellence, and more importantly, they strive to achieve the epitome of God's favor, and that is to free the captive, to educate and feed the orphan. Orphan under the concept of one who does not know, one who is weak, one who is bereft of the necessary things of life. Definitions on that line. And for African American Muslims and the Muslims in America, Caucasians and Latinos, this is the ideal world that they try to transition into. You can see this template in the surah, the translation of the surah that we offer you. And fulfilling this template's goals, Muslims serving as prison chaplains are aware that they are constantly around them forces which either threaten to help them or to cause them to fail. And working from within such a template, a Muslim chaplain has to discern how best to help what's in front of him, the Native American, the Jewish inmate, the Christian inmate, the Catholic inmate, the members of groups like the Moorish Science Temple and other groups spin-off that are seen not on the outside, but typically seen only in prisons, but have attained a credibility as being a legitimate inmate religion. How to deal with each one of those so that the best outcome of what they believe can happen. They also have to look out for the captive, those who are in prison illegally. Prisons we know about and those about which we are just finding out some information. Until very recently, the task of the Muslim chaplain working in prisons was undertaken by such groups as the Nation of Islam, the Moorish Science Temple of America, and by members of the community of Imam Frederick Muhammad. But this is changing. And the places where a person can be a Muslim chaplain is also changing to include universities and hospitals. And as a prison situation changes because of world politics, so too the circumstances of the Muslim chaplain and chaplains in general. But for the Muslim chaplain, influences that are impinging upon our world is the continual implementation of portions of the USA Patriot Act, the war on terror, Islamophobia, and a newer phenomenon, the replacement of former chaplains, these members of the Nation of Islam, these members of the community of Imam Frederick Muhammad, by chaplains who are from Muslim cultures. And the Islam that served prisons well, rehabilitating, making better people once they got out, this African American Islam is fading. So as properly and traditionally trained chaplains emerge from these new vetting agencies, these college-based vetting agencies that produce chaplaincies, certificates, diplomas, etc., we notice that fewer and fewer are people like the vanguard of Muslim chaplains that broke the barriers and got laws passed so that people who were Muslims could worship properly inside prisons. And the skills that are required now are such skills as speaking Arabic fluently, understanding the Hadith, and knowing the formulaic utterances that go along with ritual worship. And as we look at these changes, as the old guard is replaced by the new guard, we see animosities and we see difficulties in communication. I was at a meeting trying to help a local university come up with an idea of how to approach a certificate program for chaplaincy, Muslim chaplaincy. And two of the people at the table, including and myself, had been in the system and the places and times as I indicated. One was from Indiana's penitentiary, one was from Washington, D.C. area. And the two new people were from Muslim countries and had not worked in prisons before. And as the discussion was open and moved forward, it was obvious that they were ridiculing what was the life's work of African American chaplains who were there, sitting there. And that's a major concern going forward. The bulk of prisoners in the American, Muslim prisoners in the American penal system are still African Americans. How are these new chaplains going to work out in that setting? This last one is called Oops, and I'll close with this. My last effort at working as a chaplain, I was forced into it. They needed some help at the Metropolitan Correctional Center here in Chicago. And after saying I wouldn't do it several times, they convinced me. It made me an offer I couldn't refuse. And so I went to work there. But I told them, I said, listen, I'm not just going to be working for you guys. I still am a person who has responsibilities to the larger community. So sometimes I have to talk to the media or participate in forums or whatever. Yeah, no problem. So I think I just appeared on the PBS homegrown program looking at our Muslim terrorists being forged in our prison system. And a so-called expert on terrorism and Muslim prisoners' terrorism made a comment, and I was asked to respond to it. And my interview was live on CNN. Had the interview, I made the points that I had to make. And about 2 or 3 days later, the chaplain at the MCC called me and said, why does the warden want to see me? I said, I don't know. Could it be my CNN interview? He said, you're what? He said, you're on CNN? I said, yes. He said, you can't do that. I told you, I said, I can't help not do that. So I was terminated without notice, without any further communication. And as the situation obtains now in the world, in the United States, the Muslim chaplain becomes the captive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here in your presence. In the United States, we incarcerate more citizens than any other country. One commonly hears the United States is addicted to incarceration, that we are a prison society. The truth is that the United States not only incarcerates individuals, but whole segments of our population. If you're poor, black, young, and male, there's a far greater likelihood to be incarcerated. Black males are 6 to 7 times more likely to be incarcerated than whites. And that is not reflective of crime rate, but reflective of deeper social injustices. You really can't talk about the criminal justice system and incarceration in the United States without its relationship with social justice. They're interconnected. As Christians, as with other traditions, we're called to serve the common good, which can only be realized by assuring that each individual can reach his or her potential as a human person. Human dignity is both inviolable and inalienable. We're held to the inherent dignity of each person. Now, admittedly, there's a tension within the Catholic approaches to dealing with crime, punishment, and justice. On the one hand, you have the Catholic tradition that insists that criminal behavior and that harms others and violates the rights of another human being cannot be tolerated. But on the other hand, the Church upholds the inherent dignity of all people. All are children of God, including victims and offenders, and maintains that every person bears the potential for redemption and restoration to full relationships with God and with neighbor. Catholic social teaching is built upon the conviction that every human being bears the image of God. This conviction has social, cultural, economic, and political implications, and it demands that we treat all members of our society as fully human beings. It goes on that we are required to ensure that every person has the resources necessary to participate in the dignity, unity, and equality of all people. All systems, all institutions, or structures that contribute to marginalization, disempowerment, or endangerment of any human person stands starkly against that belief. There's a growing voice that the criminal justice system in the United States is beyond repair and needs to be dismantled. Statistics are staggering. 7.3 million adults in the United States are under some form of supervision, probation, parole, jail, prison, by state, local, and federal justice systems. 1.6 million people are in prisons, 800,000 in jails. In the last 40 years, since 1972, a 540% increase. The United States has less than 5% of the world's population, and it holds 25% of the world's incarcerated people. While these numbers are troubling enough to raise serious questions about our criminal justice systems, discrepancy related to race and ethnicity among the incarcerated population adds greater urgency. Racial and ethnic minority populations are incarcerated at astounding rates in comparison to adults. A black male, young, 6 to 7 times more likely to be incarcerated. In Cook County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center right here, 98% of the youth are youth of color. Many for nonviolent cases, drug cases. And the research tells us that youth buy and sell drugs in proportion to the percentage of the population. There's not a lot of data regarding the socioeconomic status of those who are incarcerated, but 4/5 of felony defendants in the 75 most populous counties in the United States are required to have public defense. And those who had public counsel were sentenced to jail or prison at higher rates and for longer sentences than those who had private counsel. Olu's this kid that I know and work with who has been incarcerated and ultimately given electronic monitoring and house arrest. This is an alternative to imprisonment. But what they failed to understand, what the judge and the court failed to understand, that Olu, though given house arrest, was homeless. His entire family lived in the front room of a family friend. 6 individuals in a one-bedroom home, apartment, public housing, sleeping in the front room. There's this growing disconnection between the criminal justice system and the community in which they purportedly keep safe. More and more there's evidence that the harm done by the criminal justice system outweighs the good. In addition, we are one of the few countries who tries our children as adults. In Illinois, as in many states, youth as young as 13 can receive a life sentence without the possibility of parole. In Illinois, there are 99 who, as juveniles, live under the sentence of life without parole. In the United States, upwards of 2,500. Inspired by John Paul II's message of Jubilee Year, Jubilee in Prisons, the Catholic bishops of the United States sought to make John Paul's general message for prisoners worldwide more particular in the United States. In 2000, the U.S. Catholic bishops wrote a statement entitled Responsibility, Rehabilitation, and Restoration, a Catholic Perspective on Crime and Criminal Justice. In it, they advocated for rehabilitative and restorative reforms in the criminal justice system in the United States. This was the first document issued by the bishops about crime and criminal justice since the 1970s. And in that document, they acknowledged the need to see beyond merely a crisis in the criminal justice system. They emphasized the necessity of recognizing that prisoners are human beings created in the image of God and endowed with free will, whose basic rights and dignity cannot be violated. They go on to suggest several reforms, including restorative justice, vocational training, education, prisons located in populous areas closer to families from where the prisoners come from, etc. While they admitted to the economic inequalities of the criminal justice system, the recommendations mainly focus on prison reform, making prisons a better place to live, not the inequities in our society that may create prisons filled with poor men and women of color in the first place. In that same document, they admit that our criminal justice system is in crises. But really, they fail adequately to speak forcefully enough of how the criminal justice system is both the result of and the cause of the social injustices in these states. On the one hand, our criminal justice system reflects the numerous injustices that mar our society. The creation of mass incarceration is the result of economic, cultural, political, and social factors coalescing into a drive for a more punitive criminal system. On the other hand, these systems help sustain the social injustices, marginalizing, disempowering, and endangering our neighbors and our communities. Because of particular policy decisions, money has been funneled away from education, mental health care, substance abuse treatment, job training and development that would contribute to the well-being of the members of our community. Because the penalties that continue long after imprisonment, the criminal justice system has limited employment and educational opportunities for those who continue to be impacted by the criminal justice system long after they have done their time in prison. Men and women who have felonies in their background are limited to what kind of jobs they can have, housing, voting, education, and a host of other obstacles that hinder their ability to make positive changes in their own lives. These effects don't just hit people who are convicted of crime, but their families as well, and their communities and their friends, and ultimately all of us in our society. I know a 17-year-old with a felony conviction who is prohibited from living with his family, who is on Section 8 public housing. The burden of that ongoing punishment is not borne evenly in our society. Offering a practical guidance, the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops focuses on criminal justice reform, but not sufficiently on the way in which our criminal justice crises both reflects and sustains racial and economic disparities. While previous documents, A Community Response to Crime and Rebuilding Human Lives, do highlight ways in which lessening the harms caused by our criminal justice system may improve society as a whole, that is, acknowledge that our criminal justice system contributes to social injustice. The assumption is that social injustice only indirectly leads to the growth of criminal justice systems by fostering crime. However, there's evidence that crime rates and incarceration rates are largely independent of one another. Hopefully, the tide is turning somewhat. The United States Bishops' Committee on Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs is one of 43 members of an ecumenical group, Christian Churches Together, which recently drafted a statement on mass incarceration, denouncing its dehumanizing effects, its disproportionate toll on minorities and the poor, and its failure to restore inmates to being productive members of our society. Pope Francis, in his recent visits to prisons in Italy, spoke continually about the challenges faced by inmates returning to society and their need for them to have hope. But perhaps the greatest challenge is to engage the local community as agents of change. Most Catholic parishes, most schools, most organizations live in the darkness when it comes to the issue of incarceration in the United States. While the systems have to be changed to ensure the dignity of all people, the local church needs to take up the work of ensuring that the voices of those impacted are heard. Frankly, a more prophetic voice is called for. One of the more hopeful efforts is this collaboration of interdenominational faith-based organizations working together to establish community restorative justice hubs, which are organizations that seek to be in relationship with both those who are impacted by incarceration and also the systems and stakeholders within our community, and to form, if you will, a web of relationships that support and help people who are incarcerated and coming out of incarceration. I wonder, as Catholics, if we would given as much time, resources, energy to mass incarceration as we do to other issues: right to life, religious freedom, immigration reform. Perhaps then we'd have a more fruitful dialogue.